The dog had a name nobody used anymore. His official designation was Echo 7, stamped on a metal tag that clinked against the kennel door every time he lunged at it. The handlers at Fort Kellison called him by other names: Killer, Problem, that damn dog. And none of them were wrong exactly. Echo had taken down 2 experienced canine trainers in 3 weeks. He'd shredded a Kevlar glove that was rated for bear encounters. He'd stopped eating on a Tuesday and hadn't started again by Friday. And the base veterinarian, Dr. Pembroke, had walked out of the kennel bay with a torn sleeve and a clipboard full of checkboxes, the last of which read, "Recommend euthanasia. Handler deceased. Animal non-responsive to all reintegration protocols." Nobody argued with him. Nobody except Taryn Locke, and she wasn't even supposed to be there. Taryn was 31 years old, a trauma nurse at Kellison's on-post medical center, and she had what her supervisor called a boundary problem, and what Taryn called a general inability to walk away from things that are still breathing. She'd been at the base 8 months, transferred in from a Level I trauma center in San Antonio after a patient had coded on her table 3 times in one shift and lived all 3. Which should have been a triumph, but had instead left her with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that doesn't go away with sleep. She'd wanted somewhere quieter. She'd gotten Fort Kellison, which was not quiet in any traditional sense, but was at least a different category of chaos. She heard about Echo the way everyone did, through the break room, through the particular brand of word of mouth that moves through military installations like smoke under a door. A combat canine whose handler had been murdered 6 weeks ago in what was still officially an open investigation. A dog that had been present at the scene, that had tried to alert, that nobody had listened to. A dog that had since become, in the words of Sergeant Dolan, who she'd overheard by the coffee machine, a liability we're 24 hours from putting down. She shouldn't have gone to the kennel bay. She went anyway. The facility wasn't locked to her. She had base access, a valid badge, and the particular walk of someone who belongs everywhere she goes. Confident, slightly distracted, carrying a coffee cup like a prop. The handler on duty, a young specialist named Bowen, looked up from his phone when she pushed through the door and started to say something, and Taryn said, "Doctor." Pembroke sent me to check on the food refusal, in the same tone she used when telling families their loved ones were going to be fine, the tone that makes people believe things without quite understanding why. Bowen looked back at his phone. She heard Echo before she saw him, not barking. The kennels further down were noisy. 2 Belgian Malinois running a greeting protocol, a Labrador making its feelings known about the dinner delay. Echo's kennel was in the far corner, and from it came a sound that stopped Taryn halfway down the aisle. A low, rhythmic vocalization. Not a growl, not a whine. Something in between, something she didn't have a word for, cycling in and out with a cadence that reminded her absurdly of the telemetry monitors in the ICU. She stopped outside the kennel. Echo was in the back corner, shoulders hunched, head low. He was a German shepherd, probably 5 or 6 years old, still muscled despite the week of barely eating, his coat dull in a way that read less like neglect and more like grief. There were claw marks on the kennel walls at approximately chest height, not the random scratching of a bored dog, but patterned, repetitive, like something being counted or communicated. His eyes, when he finally lifted them, were amber and absolutely exhausted. She'd seen that look before, not on a dog, on a soldier. She crouched down slowly, not putting her hands anywhere near the chain link, just bringing herself to his level. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, because she'd spent the last 3 years of her career at trauma centers studying animal-assisted therapy protocols as a personal project, something she'd never quite been able to justify putting on a resume, she reached into the specific vocabulary she'd accumulated and said, quietly, in Czech, "Kemni." It was one of about 60 commands she'd memorized from a handbook published by the German and Czech K9 military working dog programs, languages that the U.S. military had adopted for combat dogs specifically because they were phonetically distinct from English and harder to accidentally trigger in the field. She'd learned them the way she learned most things, obsessively, in the margins of other activities, because she'd had a patient 4 years ago, a handler whose dog had been confiscated after an incident, and she'd wanted to understand what that meant, what it cost. Echo lifted his head, just slightly, just enough. She said another one, "Sedni, sit." He didn't sit, but he stopped making the sound. She stayed there for 47 minutes, crouched outside his kennel with a cooling coffee on the floor beside her, moving through the vocabulary slowly, not commanding him so much as speaking to him, letting the sounds fill the space between them. When she finally stood up, her knees protesting in the way that comes from years of hospital floors, Echo was 3 feet from the kennel door instead of the back wall, and he was watching her with an attention that felt, for the first time since his handler's death, like something other than rage. Specialist Bowen was asleep on a folding chair by the entrance. Taryn refilled her coffee from the break room thermos and went back to the medical center. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. She came back the next morning. By the 3rd visit, Echo was eating again. By the 5th, he'd let her sit inside the kennel. By the 7th, she was the only person on the base who could enter his space without him escalating, which was both a professional breakthrough and a personal complication, because the kennel staff had noticed, and the kennel staff had told someone, and that someone had told Colonel Everard, who ran the K9 unit and had been quietly managing the paperwork for Echo's euthanasia authorization, and now Taryn was sitting across a desk from him while he looked at her, the way senior officers looked at problems that had inconveniently developed faces. "You're a nurse," he said. "Trauma, yes sir, not a dog handler. No sir, not a trainer, not a vet, not a behavioral specialist. Correct." He leaned back in his chair. He was the kind of man who wore his rank in the set of his jaw all the time, even in conversation with someone technically outside his chain of command. "The dog tried to take off Sergeant Pembroke's arm. Dr. Pembroke," she said, "and he didn't try. He connected, but he pulled back before breaking the skin. That's not aggression, sir. That's communication." The colonel stared at her. "That is a very generous interpretation of an 80-pound dog going for a man's arm. Echo is 93 pounds. And the reason he reacted the way he did is because Dr. Pembroke approached him using off-leash body language that to a combat-trained dog reads as threat initiation. He doesn't speak civilian. He speaks a very specific protocol that his handler built with him over 4 years, and what he's been experiencing since Corporal Hennessy died is not aggression. It's disorientation. He's waiting for commands in a language nobody around him knows anymore." The colonel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Corporal Hennessy." "Yes, sir. You've been reading the file." "I asked to read it." Bowen let me. Another silence. Longer this time. "What do you want, Locke?" "I want 30 days, she said, "and I want access to whatever behavioral records his handler kept on him. The working logs, the training notes, whatever Hennessy documented. I can get Echo stable enough for evaluation. If he washes out after that, then the decision is yours. But right now, you're authorizing the euthanasia of a combat-deployed working dog because nobody bothered to learn the language he was trained in, and I think that's worth 30 days. Colonel Everard looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and wrote something on a form she couldn't read from across the desk. 21 days, he said, and you do this on your off hours. I'm not pulling you from the medical center. Understood. And Locke. He looked up. If he bites you, that's on you. Yes, sir, she said, and she meant it. The handler logs were kept in a manila folder that had been sitting in a property box since the investigation opened. Corporal Joel Hennessy, she started thinking of him by his first name as she read, because the logs were so specifically him, written in a handwriting that slanted hard to the right and used asterisks instead of bullet points and included, on one page, a small sketch of Echo mid-sprint that had no practical value whatsoever, but had clearly been important enough to put down on paper. Joel had been 26. He'd deployed twice, once to Afghanistan and once to a location that was redacted in the logs she'd been given. Echo had been his partner for 4 years, which in K9 terms was the longest either of them would likely have. Joel had cataloged everything. Echo's food preferences, his aversion to certain synthetic fabrics, the specific tire pressure of the vehicles that made him alert versus the ones that made him relax. 24 commands in a mixture of Czech and German and one phrase in Dutch that Joel had learned specifically because Echo had responded to it during an early training exercise and he'd simply kept using it. He'd also documented, in the last 3 weeks before his death, a series of incidents on base. Small things. A vehicle he didn't recognize parked outside the kennel bay at odd hours. A new fuel shipment that Echo had alerted on during a routine sweep, the kind of soft alert, Joel wrote, that he only does when he's not sure, when something's there but buried or diluted, and that had been cleared by the duty officer and logged as a false positive. A padlock on the equipment shed replaced overnight. Joel had listed these things in the same careful asterisks he used for everything else, and then on the last page, in handwriting slightly less even than usual, he'd written, "Something's wrong and I don't know what it is yet. Echo knows. He's been trying to tell me for 2 weeks." Joel Hennessy had been found dead in his quarters 12 days later, ruled a heart attack initially, upgraded to suspected homicide when the toxicology came back, investigation ongoing, no suspects named, no arrests. Taryn put the file down on her kitchen table and sat with it for a long time. Then she picked it up and started reading from the beginning. The next 3 weeks had a shape to them that she would describe later as two things happening in parallel, moving at different speeds, both pulling her forward. The first was Echo. He came back slowly, the way things do when they've gone somewhere very far inside themselves. She worked with him in the small outdoor area behind the kennel bay in the early mornings before her shift started, using the vocabulary from Joel's logs to rebuild a framework of communication between them. Not the same relationship he'd had with his handler. She was careful not to pretend that, but something functional, something that gave Echo a context in which the world made sense again. She learned which of the Dutch phrases he responded to most readily. She figured out that he needed to run, really run, before he could settle enough to take direction, so she started arriving 40 minutes earlier to give him that. She learned the difference between the alert he made when he smelled something concerning and the one he made when he was just bored. And they were not the same sound at all, once you knew what you were listening for. On day 9, he let her put her hand on the side of his head. She stood there for a moment with her palm against his skull, feeling the warmth of him, and thought about Joel's sketch at the back of the folder. The second thing was the investigation. She wasn't running it. She was very clear with herself about that. She was a nurse with unrestricted base access and a habit of reading things she wasn't supposed to, not a detective, not an investigator, not anything with a title that gave her standing in the matter. But the file had bothered her in the specific way that things bother people who are good at patterns. The fuel alert that got cleared too quickly, the replaced padlock, the unrecognized vehicle that Joel had noted and nobody had followed up on, because Joel was the only one who'd noticed it, and then Joel was gone. She mentioned it carefully to Captain Orrin Beckett, the MP captain handling the case, in the corridor outside the medical center after a base briefing on unrelated matters. She framed it as a concern, not an accusation. She referenced the handler logs in a way that suggested she had read them for Echo-related reasons, which was true enough. Beckett listened with the particular expression of someone who is being professional about managing someone they consider well-meaning but not useful. The fuel alert was logged and cleared, he said. Joel noted in his own records that he considered it a soft alert that was discontinued too early. That's in the documentation. Hennessy was meticulous, Beckett said, in a tone that made it a compliment and a dismissal at the same time. He logged everything. Some of it was relevant, some of it wasn't. And the padlock? Equipment sheds get maintenance. She walked away without pushing further because she knew that particular wall and understood there was no point. But she went back to Joel's logs that night and read the dates again. The fuel shipment alert had been April 4th. The padlock had been replaced sometime between April 6th and April 9th. Joel had died on April 19th. She thought about Echo's alert in the context of the shed. Not the fuel, specifically, but whatever the fuel had been mixed with or carrying or being used to transport. She thought about what a combat K9 is actually trained to detect. Not just explosives, not just drugs, but in the more specialized programs, specific chemical compounds that have a handful of legitimate uses and one or two that are not legitimate at all. She wasn't a forensic chemist. She was a trauma nurse. But she knew what compounds were used to induce cardiac events in ways that might not survive basic tox screening. And she knew that advanced panels had to be specifically ordered, and she knew how to read a toxicology report for what was there versus what had been looked for. She called in a favor from a pathologist she'd worked with in San Antonio. It took him 4 days and some creative consultation framing to get access to what she needed. When the information came back, she didn't call Captain Beckett. She called the Criminal Investigation Division directly. She told them about the logs. She told them about the dates. She told them about the chemical compound that Joel's toxicology had not been screened for because nobody had thought to order it. And she told them the specific reason it should have been ordered, which was that Echo had been alerting on it for weeks before Joel died, and Joel had documented every single alert in the same folder that had been sitting in a property box in a hallway at Fort Kellison because nobody had thought to look at what a dead man had been trying to say. The CID agent who took her call was a woman named Special Agent Dara White, and unlike Captain Beckett, she listened without the professional management expression. She asked 3 questions. She asked for the file number on the property box. She asked for the name of the pathologist. And she asked, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but simply precise, "Is the dog still available?" "Yes," Taryn said. "We may need him." What happened next was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic on television. It did not happen fast. It happened in the way that real investigations happen, which is slowly and with significant amounts of paperwork and with a great deal of waiting in corridors. But it happened. The equipment shed, on re-examination, had traces of the compound Echo had flagged. Not enough to matter anymore, not enough to prove anything by itself, but enough to establish that the alert had been legitimate. The replaced padlock traced to a requisition order that had been entered under a credentials number that didn't match the duty roster for that week. That credentials number traced to a warrant officer named Gaines, who had logged himself as off-site on April 6th through the 9th, and who, when interviewed, produced documentation for his off-site location that took 6 days to fall apart under scrutiny. She didn't know all of this in real time. White called her twice with updates that were careful and limited and framed as courtesy notifications, not briefings. But she was a trauma nurse, and she was good at reading what people were saying alongside what they were actually saying, and by the second call, she understood that the investigation had moved somewhere substantial. Echo was brought in for a formal evidence sweep of 2 locations on base. She was not allowed to observe, but she'd spent 3 weeks rebuilding his vocabulary, and she put together a briefing card, 12 commands, pronunciation guides, the specific way he signaled a hard alert versus a soft one, and gave it to the handler who took him in. That handler, Sergeant First Class Maya Delacroix, came back afterward and told Taryn, in the direct way of someone who has been trained to be economical with words, that he had performed exceptionally. "He found something," Taryn said. Delacroix looked at her for a moment. "I'm not able to confirm or deny the specifics of an active investigation." "Right," Taryn said. "Of course." Delacroix started to walk away, then stopped. She had a way of standing that reminded Taryn of people who have learned to take up less space than they need. "He's a good dog," she said, not quite looking at Taryn. "Joel trained him right." "He did," Taryn said. Delacroix nodded once and left. 29 days after Colonel Everard had written 21 on a form Taryn still hadn't seen, she sat in his office again. He didn't make her wait this time. "Echo has been cleared for continued service," he said, "pending full behavioral reassessment, which I'm recommending be conducted over an additional 60-day period." He paused. "Dr. Pembroke has agreed to defer to your assessment of his reintegration progress." "That's—" "Yes, sir." "Thank you." "Gaines has been detained." He said it without inflection, the way people say things that are too large for ordinary sentence structure. "I'm not able to discuss the specifics with you, I understand. What I can tell you is that the investigation has been significantly assisted by the documentation that was recovered from Hennessy's handler logs." He stopped again. "Joel was thorough." "He was," she said. The colonel picked up his pen in the way he had, the gesture that ended conversations. Then he set it back down. "Locke, what you did, going to the CID rather than working through the MP channel after Beckett dismissed you. Some people would have let it go." "I know, sir. Most people would have." She thought about Joel's last line. "Echo knows. He's been trying to tell me for 2 weeks." She thought about the 47 minutes she'd sat outside a kennel, listening to a grieving dog make a sound she didn't have a word for, and how it had taken her back to the ICU, to patients who couldn't say what was wrong but were still, somehow, saying it if you were quiet enough to hear. "I work with people who can't always tell me what's hurting them," she said finally. "You learn to listen in other ways." The colonel looked at her for a moment that went slightly longer than professional. Then he nodded, once, and picked up his pen. The 60-day reassessment became a permanent reassignment. It wasn't standard. Nothing about any of it was standard. But Echo needed a primary contact, someone who knew his vocabulary and his tells, and the specific angle at which he held his left ear when something had his attention in the middle distance, and the K9 unit didn't have a handler with both the language skills and the clearance background that the program required in the interim. And Taryn had worked enough double shifts to accumulate a leave balance that her supervisor had been quietly alarmed by for months. It was Colonel Everard who proposed it. She later found out it had taken him 4 days of paperwork and 2 calls above his pay grade. She wasn't a handler. She was still a nurse, still split between the medical center and the kennel bay, still the person who got paged at 3 in the morning when the ER got complicated. But 3 mornings a week, she was in the outdoor yard with Echo before the base woke up, working through the vocabulary that Joel had built, adding to it carefully, learning the parts of his language that weren't in any handbook. She started keeping her own logs. Not as formal as Joel's, written in a spiral notebook she bought at the commissary, her handwriting not slanting the way his had, but still, in some indefinable way, following the same impulse, to write down what she was learning from a creature who couldn't speak, because the act of writing it made it real, made it transferable, meant that someone else could read it later and understand. She started the logs for Echo. She kept them for every dog that came after. There were others. Over the following 2 years, 3 more K9s at Kellison came through what Taryn had started calling, in her own head, the language problem. Dogs whose handlers were gone, whose command vocabularies were undocumented, who had been written off as unsalvageable when what they actually were was untranslatable. She found her way to each of them through the same combination of base access and refusal to accept the paperwork as the final word. Not all of them made it. One, a Malinois named in the records only as Coda, had injuries from his last deployment that the behavioral crisis had masked, and once the crisis resolved, the injuries became clear, and the veterinary team made a different call. She sat with him the afternoon before. She didn't think it was enough, but she didn't have anything else to offer. She kept his file. She kept all of them. What grew out of those files, out of the logs and the vocabulary cards and the contact sheets and the behavioral notes, written in her own handwriting alongside Joel's and Sergeant Delacroix's, and 2 other handlers who'd started sharing their documentation with her, was not a program at first. It was just a folder. Then it was a protocol. Then it was 3 pages she submitted carefully to the K9 Unit Veterinary Liaison with a cover letter that used the phrase last resort evaluation 4 times, because she'd learned that language too, the language of institutions, and she knew which words opened doors. The protocol was adopted, first at Kellison, then, after a write-up in a military veterinary journal that she'd had nothing to do with but that cited her work, at 2 other installations. A research team from Fort Leonard Wood reached out to ask if she'd be willing to consult on a documentation standardization project. She said yes. She drove 4 hours to the meeting and sat in a conference room full of behavioral scientists and veterinarians, and felt, for the first time in years, like she was in exactly the right room. She still worked trauma. She still showed up at 3 in the morning when things got complicated. She still had, in her supervisor's updated phrasing, a boundary problem, though the way he said it now carried something that sounded like respect. Echo retired from active service on a Thursday in October. 2 years and 4 months after the morning, Taryn had first crouched outside his kennel and spoken to him in a language no one else on the base knew anymore. The retirement ceremony was small. A few members of the K9 unit, Colonel Everard in his going-away uniform, Sergeant Delacroix, who had by then become the person Taryn went to when she needed to think out loud about a dog. Echo stood quietly through the whole thing, his amber eyes moving around the small crowd with the calm attention of an animal that has been, for some time now, sure of where it is. The adoption paperwork had been submitted 3 weeks earlier. The colonel had signed it himself. She drove home with Echo in the back seat, which was technically against the manufacturer's safety recommendation for the vehicle, but which she had decided to accept as a known risk. He pressed his nose against the window the whole drive, watching the base recede and the highway open up, the afternoon light cutting low and golden across the fields on either side of the road. She thought about Joel's log, the last entry, the slightly uneven handwriting. Echo knows. He's been trying to tell me for 2 weeks. He'd been right. Echo had known. He'd been telling anyone who would listen, in the only language available to him, with everything he had. All it had taken was someone willing to learn the words. She reached back and put her hand on the side of his head, the same way she had on day 9, in the kennel when he'd first let her. He exhaled slowly. She felt him settle. Outside, the road kept going, and the light stayed gold for a long time.